He was the Crips Kingpin who ruled the streets with respect and fed his enemies before they pulled the trigger. In a world where betrayal was currency, Keith Stone Thomas wasn't just a gangster. He was a legend. A man feared by rivals, loved by his community, and haunted by loyalty that cost him everything. This isn't just another street tale. This is a story of power, brotherhood, and ultimate betrayal. Welcome to American Gang War, where we uncover the real stories behind America's deadliest streets. Today, we dive deep into the rise and fall of Keith Stone Thomas, the Crip boss who showed mercy to the men who would take his life. Night swallowed Dwart, California whole on January 30th, 1992. The kind of darkness that feels heavy, oppressive, like the sky itself is holding its breath. Between the silent rows of avocado trees on Royal Oaks Drive, an abandoned SUV sat like a tomb, its metallic paint reflecting the pale moonlight that filtered through the branches above. The engine had gone cold hours ago. The doors were locked from the outside, a deliberate choice by whoever had left it there. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't someone forgetting where they parked. This was intentional. This was final. Inside that vehicle, two men slumped forward in their seats, their bodies frozen in the terrible stillness that only death brings. Their hands were bound behind their backs with wire. Not rope, not handcuffs, but wire. The kind that cuts into flesh and leaves marks. The kind that says this was planned. Both men had been shot execution style, bullets entering their skulls from behind. Professional, cold, calculated. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical. This was business. This was betrayal in its purest form. One of the dead men was Keith Stone Thomas, 30 years old, an original gangster from the Rollins 60 neighborhood Crips, a name that once commanded respect across every boulevard in South Central Los Angeles. A man who could walk into any hood and be acknowledged with a nod of recognition. A man even rival gang members spoke of with a certain reverence. The other man, whose name has largely been lost to history, was Stone's associate, someone who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place to show loyalty to a friend who needed backup. When the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department discovered the bodies the next morning, the scene told a story. The wire bindings spoke of premeditation. The locked doors suggested the killers wanted time before the bodies were found. The location, far from South Central, in the quiet agricultural area of Dwart, indicated this was meant to be discreet, away from prying eyes. The Los Angeles Times would later write, "It was unthinkable that someone of his stature, a warrior, a survivor of countless street battles, would die not in battle, but in betrayal, not facing his enemies, but ambushed by those he called friends." This wasn't a drive-by shooting, the kind that had become horrifyingly common in South Central. This wasn't retaliation for some gang beef or territorial dispute. This wasn't even about respect or reputation. This was business gone catastrophically wrong. A marijuana consignment that went sideways. A pickup that turned into an ambush. A transaction that became an execution. The killers? 4 young doc Crips. Kids Stone had broken bread with. Guys he'd fronted weight to, extending them credit and trust in a world where both were rare currencies. Guys who'd sat at tables with him, shared meals, called him Cuz. the term Crips used to denote brotherhood. Guys who decided that robbing their supplier was easier than paying him back. That murder was simpler than honoring a debt. Witnesses would later report, some to police, others only in whispered conversations that would never make it into official reports. Hearing Stone's final words. As the guns were drawn and the reality of the situation became clear, as Stone realized these young men he'd trusted were about to take his life, he made one last appeal to whatever conscience they might possess. "You ain't got to do us like this, cuz," he pleaded, his voice carrying both desperation and disappointment. Not begging for his life exactly, but appealing to a code, a set of principles he believed they shared. It didn't matter. The bullets came anyway, fast, final, unforgiving. By sunrise, as the California sun rose over Los Angeles, word spread through South Central like a shockwave, traveling through the invisible networks that connected every corner, every set, every hood. From Crenshaw to Century, from Slauson to Hyde Park, from the Jungle to Watts. OGs from every set, Crips who should have been celebrating a rival's death, Bloods who'd been at war with the Rollins 60s for years, even gangsters from sets that had no direct connection to Stone. All stood silent. Because Stone wasn't just another casualty in the endless gang wars that had turned South Central into a war zone. He was a relic. A man who still lived by the old code when the new generation had already forgotten it ever existed. A man who believed that even in the criminal underworld, there were rules. That honor meant something. That loyalty wasn't just a word you threw around. His death marked more than a murder. It marked the end of an era. The final collapse of a system that had already been crumbling for years. It was the moment when the last believers in the old ways realized that the world they'd known was gone forever. This is the story of Keith Stone Thomas, the last OG who still believed in a code. A man who lived by principles in a world that had stopped caring about them. A story about loyalty and betrayal, about the rise and fall of street empires, about the deadly collision between old values and new ruthlessness. This is a story about how the streets of South Central Los Angeles ate their own children, and how one man's belief in honor became the weapon that killed him. Keith Cardell. Thomas came into the world on a summer day in 1961 on a quiet block off Samarin Street in South Central Los Angeles. The small bungalow where his mother brought him home had 2 bedrooms, peeling paint, and a front yard with grass that struggled to stay green in the California heat. It was modest, working class, but it was home. He was born into a single-parent household, no father in sight, a story that was becoming increasingly common in Black communities across America. But his mother was exceptional, a woman who refused to be defined by circumstances or statistics. She was a UCLA graduate at a time when Black women earning university degrees was far from common. She worked in public health for Los Angeles County, dedicating her career to helping communities that looked like her own. Educated, driven, fiercely intelligent, she was determined to give her sons a life that wasn't trapped by the zip code printed on their mail. She represented everything right about Black excellence in a city that seemed designed to crush it. She kept books in the house, made sure her sons did their homework, talked to them about college like it was an expectation, not a distant dream. She sacrificed constantly, working long hours to keep food on the table and clothes on their backs. She was everything the stereotype said Black single mothers weren't: engaged, educated, present. But determination alone couldn't shield a boy from what the city was becoming. No amount of motherly love could change the fundamental reality of being young and Black in South Central Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s. Los Angeles in those years was a powder keg waiting for a match. The city had been shaped by decades of racist housing policies, redlining that trapped Black families in specific neighborhoods, employment discrimination that limited economic opportunities. The promises of the Great Migration, that California would be different, better, a land of opportunity, were revealing themselves as hollow for far too many. Racial tension simmered on every corner, in every interaction between residents and the police, who were supposed to protect them. Unemployment ravaged Black communities, creating a generation of young men with time, energy, and nowhere to direct it constructively. The ghost of the Watts riots of 1965 still smoldered under the asphalt, a violent reminder that the city's promises of prosperity didn't extend to everyone equally. Young Keith watched his neighborhood change before his eyes. The white families who'd lived on adjacent blocks began moving out in the phenomenon that would come to be known as white flight. As they left, property values dropped. City services declined. Schools received less funding. The economic death spiral that would devastate inner cities across America was beginning. The neighborhoods were changing faster than families could adapt. Gangs were forming, not yet as the criminal empires they'd become, but as defense lines. Young men protecting their blocks because nobody else would. Not the police, who were more likely to harass than help. Not the politicians, who only showed up during election years. Not the system that had already written them off as statistics rather than human beings. The Crips were just beginning to organize in the early 1970s. Started by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams, they initially called themselves the Cripples or Cribs, young men with canes who walked together for protection. The mythology says they were trying to create a Black empowerment organization, though how much of that is true and how much is retrospective mythology is debatable. What's certain is that the Crips filled a vacuum. They provided identity, protection, and belonging for young men who'd been denied all three by the broader society. They created their own economy in a world that offered them no legitimate economic opportunities. The streets were choosing sides, and boys like Keith were being drafted whether they liked it or not. You could try to stay neutral, but neutrality was dangerous. Not being affiliated left you vulnerable to everyone. The choice wasn't really whether to join. It was which side to choose. Keith's mother fought against this reality with everything she had. She kept him involved in school activities, made sure he came home before dark, knew who his friends were. But she was fighting against forces larger than any individual's determination. Young Keith was smart, observant, quieter than many boys his age. He watched how things worked, noticed patterns, understood that the official rules, the ones teachers and parents talked about, weren't the real rules that governed his world. The real rules were unwritten, enforced through violence or the threat of it, and completely different from what adults pretended society was. He learned to read situations, to sense when tension was building, to recognize danger before it fully materialized. These were survival skills in a neighborhood where misreading a situation could get you killed. Keith was 13 years old when the first gun was pointed at his face. 13. An age when he should have been worried about school dances and basketball games and whether girls liked him. Instead, he learned a lesson about how America saw him that would shape the rest of his life. It happened in West Los Angeles, far from his neighborhood. It should have been a normal afternoon. His mother had some banking to do, and she'd brought Keith and his cousin along. The boys were dressed nicely. Their mother insisted on that whenever they left the neighborhood. Clean clothes, fresh haircuts, looking respectable, as she called it. They entered the bank together, the three of them. It was in a nice area, the kind of place where the carpet was thick and clean, where everyone spoke in quiet voices, where the tellers smiled professionally at customers. Two clean-cut black teenagers and their mother, waiting in line, minding their own business. A teller noticed them. Later, no one could explain exactly why what happened next happened. Maybe it was the way the boys looked around, taking in their surroundings the way teenagers do in unfamiliar places. Maybe it was simple racism, the assumption that black teenage boys in a bank must be there for criminal purposes. Maybe it was paranoia, born from too many bank robbery headlines. Maybe it was all of those things combined. But she whispered something to a colleague, who picked up a phone. And within minutes, the quiet, professional atmosphere of that bank exploded into chaos. More than a dozen police officers stormed through the doors with weapons drawn. Not pulled, but drawn, pointed, ready to fire. The kind of response you'd expect for an active hostage situation or armed robbery in progress. "Get down," someone shouted, voices overlapping, multiple officers yelling commands. "Hands where I can see them. Don't move. Get on the ground." The two boys froze. Time slowed to a crawl, the way it does in moments of pure terror. 1 second, they were standing in line, thinking about nothing in particular. The next second, they were staring down the barrels of multiple guns, held by men who looked at them like they were dangerous criminals. Their mother screamed, "They're children. What are you doing? They're children." Her voice was raw with terror and fury. She'd spent her whole life working within the system, believing in it, trusting it. She'd gotten her education, worked her respectable job, raised her children right. And now that system had guns pointed at her babies. "I didn't do nothing," Keith said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to control it. He was staring down the barrels of guns he didn't understand, held by men who seemed ready to kill him. "I didn't do nothing." His hands were up. His cousin's hands were up. Their mother was still screaming. Other customers had pressed themselves against walls, terrified by the sudden explosion of police force. The tellers looked confused, frightened, uncertain what was happening. The officers eventually realized their mistake. No robbery, no weapons, just two scared kids and their terrified mother. Just a mother trying to do her banking with her sons. No apology came, no explanation, no acknowledgement of error. Just orders to move along, delivered in voices that suggested the boys were somehow at fault for the misunderstanding. As if their mere presence in a nice bank was inherently suspicious. As if being black teenagers in the wrong neighborhood was itself a crime. They left that bank in silence, Keith's mother was shaking, trying to hold back tears of rage and fear. His cousin looked shell-shocked. Keith felt something inside him crack and shift. That moment stayed with him forever. A silent trauma that changed how he saw the world and his place in it. He learned a bitter lesson that day. The system didn't protect boys who looked like him. The police weren't there to serve and protect his community. They were there to control and intimidate it. Survival meant never showing fear again, because fear made you vulnerable. Survival meant building your own protection because you couldn't count on anyone else's. It was a radicalizing moment. Though 13-year-old Keith probably didn't have that language for it. He just knew that something fundamental had shifted. That the world his mother described, where education and respectability would protect you, wasn't the world he actually lived in. He couldn't unlearn that lesson. Couldn't forget the feeling of having guns pointed at his face for doing nothing wrong. Couldn't forget his mother's screams or the casual indifference of the officers who'd traumatized them. That incident planted a seed. A understanding that the straight path his mother wanted for him might not be possible. That society had already decided what he was before he'd had a chance to decide for himself. By the time he reached high school, that seed had grown into something else entirely. The Crenshaw corridor in the late 1970s was alive with contradictions. It was beautiful and terrible, vibrant and deadly, full of life and saturated with death. The neighborhood pulsed with energy, creativity, and danger, all mixed together. Low-riders rumbled past liquor stores, their hydraulics bouncing to Parliament Funkadelic blasting from custom sound systems. The cars were art projects, candy paint jobs, intricate upholstery, chrome that gleamed in the California sun. They represented pride, craftsmanship, cultural identity. Funk music mixed with the sharp crack of gunfire echoing from blocks away. George Clinton's cosmic philosophy played out against the soundtrack of gang wars. Beauty and violence lived side by side, inseparable, two sides of the same community. Fashion was distinctive. Crisp white t-shirts, Dickies pants pressed with perfect creases, Chuck Taylor All-Stars or Nike Cortez sneakers, Pendletons and khakis. The style was sharp, intentional, a form of uniform that signaled both affiliation and pride. The corner stores were community centers. Barbershops were information exchanges. Basketball courts were neutral territories where truces held, at least temporarily. Churches tried to offer sanctuary and salvation, though fewer young men were listening. It was here, in this complex ecosystem of survival and culture, that Keith earned the nickname that would follow him to his grave: Stone. The story of how he got that name has been told different ways by different people, but the essence remains consistent. He earned it through his demeanor, his presence, his unshakable nature. Not because he was cold-blooded or ruthless, though he could be when necessary, when the situation demanded it. He earned it because nothing shook him. While other young men reacted with emotion, with anger, fear, impulse, Keith responded with calculation. He could stare down a crowd without blinking, outthink a fight before it started, calm a situation that should have exploded into violence with just words and presence. There are stories from those days. A confrontation at a party where guns were drawn and Stone stepped between two groups, talking both sides down with a combination of reason and implied threat. A situation where younger guys wanted to retaliate immediately for some disrespect, and Stone convinced them to wait, to be strategic, to hit back harder when it was unexpected. He had a way of reading people, understanding what they really wanted versus what they said they wanted, knowing when to push and when to back off. These were rare skills, especially in someone so young. The Rollins 60 neighborhood Crips were still young then, having formed in the early to mid-1970s. They took their name from Rollins Street, a stretch of road that defined their territory. The number 60 referred to their numerical designation in the larger Crips organization, though the structure was never as formal as that makes it sound. What had started as neighborhood protection had evolved into something more organized, more dangerous, more profitable. The Crips weren't just defending their blocks anymore. They were controlling them, controlling who could sell drugs where, controlling who could wear what colors, controlling territory like it was property they owned. Stone didn't stumble into gang life. He walked in with eyes wide open. By his late teens, he'd become an enforcer, someone called upon when violence was necessary, but needed to be controlled. Then a shot caller, someone whose opinion carried weight in decisions about moves the set made. He earned respect not through random violence, but through strategic thinking. He understood what many young gangsters didn't. Fear was temporary, but respect could last. You could make someone afraid of you, but that fear disappeared the moment you looked weak or vulnerable. Respect, earned through consistency and fairness, lasted even when you weren't present. He also understood the code, the unwritten rules that separated organized crime from chaos. These weren't rules written down anywhere. They were passed from OG to younger members through example and explanation. Never involve civilians in gang business. The beef was between sets, not between you and regular people trying to live their lives. If you brought civilians into it, you made enemies of entire communities. Never touch women or children. This rule was about pragmatism as much as morality. Going after women and kids was a line that once crossed, invited retaliation without limit. Honor your debts. If you borrowed money or product, you paid it back. Your word was your bond. Breaking it destroyed your reputation completely. Protect your neighborhood. This was the original purpose of the gangs, and it still mattered. You looked out for the families on your block, even if they weren't involved in gang life. Never snitch. The police were not your allies. Talking to them made you a snitch, and snitches got stitches, or worse. And above all, loyalty meant something. You didn't betray the people who had your back. You didn't switch sides when things got difficult. You rode for your set like they'd ride for you. These weren't just platitudes or nice-sounding phrases. They were survival tactics, practical rules that kept the violence from spiraling completely out of control. They were what separated the OGs who lasted from the youngsters who died or went to prison before they turned 21. Stone took these rules seriously. He lived by them, enforced them, taught them to younger guys coming up. In doing so, he built a reputation that extended far beyond the Rollins 60s. Other sets knew his name. Rival gang members might want him dead, but they respected him. Even the police, in their own way, recognized that Stone was different from the average street criminal. By his early 20s, Stone had survived longer than most. He'd been shot at, had been in countless confrontations, had lost friends to violence and prison. But he was still standing, still free, still building. He was becoming something rare, an OG in the truest sense, not just someone who'd been around a long time, but someone who commanded genuine respect, who other people looked to for guidance, who represented a certain standard of how things should be done. The foundation was set. The legend was growing. Stone was becoming exactly what the streets needed, a leader with principles, and that, ultimately, would be his downfall. Then came the 1980s, and everything changed. Everything. Crack cocaine hit South Central Los Angeles like a meteor strike, and the streets would never be the same. What had been a relatively organized drug trade, marijuana, powder cocaine for the wealthy, maybe some PCP, suddenly became a feeding frenzy that consumed everything in its path. The drug itself was diabolically efficient. Take powder cocaine, cook it with baking soda, and you created something that cost pennies to make but generated insane profits. It was cheap enough for anyone to afford. It produced an intense high that lasted only minutes, creating desperate, immediate addiction. And it spread through communities like wildfire. The social impact was immediate and devastating. Mothers became addicts, abandoning children to chase the next hit. Families that had held together through decades of poverty disintegrated in months. Neighborhoods that had been poor but stable became war zones. The elderly, who'd always been safe and respected, suddenly found themselves victims of robberies by addicts desperate for money. But for young men in the drug game, crack was an opportunity beyond imagination. The profit margins were astronomical. A few $100s invested could turn into thousands. Thousands could become tens of thousands. The money flowed so fast and so freely that it warped every calculation. The old rules started crumbling almost immediately. Suddenly, 14-year-olds were carrying thousands in cash and automatic weapons. Kids who should have been worried about homework and video games were making more money than their parents had ever seen. The power and wealth was intoxicating, and it came with no instruction manual about how to handle it. Suddenly, turf wars weren't about respect or history or neighborhood pride. They were about market share. A street corner that controlled a good crack spot could generate $50,000 a week. That kind of money was worth killing for, worth dying for, worth destroying entire communities for. Suddenly, loyalty became disposable because everyone was chasing the next score. Why stick with your set when the rival gang offered you more money? Why honor old alliances when breaking them could make you rich? Why follow the old code when the new game had no rules at all? The weapons changed too. The old days of Saturday night specials and revolvers gave way to semi-automatic pistols, and then to fully automatic weapons. MAC-10s, AK-47s, Uzis, guns that could spray entire blocks with bullets. The body count soared. Drive-by shootings became common. A tactic that had been relatively rare became the standard method of retaliation. Drive past a rival's block, spray it with bullets, speed away before anyone could respond. It was cowardly by the standards of the old code. You couldn't even see who you were shooting at. But it was effective and relatively safe for the shooter. The police response was heavy-handed and ineffective. The LAPD created special gang units that treated every young black man as a suspected gang member. The war on drugs became a war on communities, with mass incarceration removing entire generations of young men. But the drug trade continued unabated. Locking up dealers didn't stop demand. It just created vacancies that were filled within days. Stone watched his world transform. He watched young men he'd mentored abandon the code for quick money. He watched neighborhoods that had survived decades of poverty tear themselves apart over drug corners. He watched mothers become addicts and children become orphans. He watched the community bonds that had held South Central together, however tenuously, dissolve completely. But Stone adapted. He had to. The alternative was to become irrelevant or dead. He moved weight, marijuana primarily, which was still his main business. But yes, cocaine and crack when the money demanded it. He built a network that stretched from Los Angeles to the San Fernando Valley and beyond. He employed dozens of people, directly or indirectly. In the underground economy, he was a success story. His operation was relatively sophisticated. He didn't stand on corners himself anymore. He had people for that. He focused on supply and distribution. On the business side of the drug trade, he was a wholesaler, moving product in bulk and letting others handle retail. The money was good. Very good. Stone had nice cars, clean, well-maintained vehicles that made a statement without being flashy. Nice clothes from stores in good neighborhoods. Money to support his family and help others who needed it. By street standards, by the standards of South Central in the 1980s, he was wealthy. Yet even as he profited from the new drug economy, Stone tried to maintain the old standards. He still looked out for families in his neighborhood, making sure elderly people were protected, that single mothers had help when they needed it. He still mediated disputes between younger gang members, trying to prevent unnecessary violence. He still believed that the game had rules, even if fewer people followed them. His reputation continued to grow, but the nature of that reputation shifted. Stories circulated about Stone's fairness in business dealings, his strategic mind in planning operations, his willingness to help younger guys get on their feet with fronted product and good advice. But also stories about what happened to people who crossed him. Not random violence. Stone never shot someone just to maintain fear, but calculated consequences. A dealer who stole product would be found beaten severely enough to serve as a warning to others. Someone who snitched might disappear. The message was clear. Stone was fair until you betrayed him. And then he was absolutely ruthless. He became something rare in that era, an OG who commanded genuine respect rather than just fear. Young gangsters wanted to work with him not because they were terrified, but because he treated them fairly, paid them properly, and offered a path to success in the only economy available to them. He also became something of a mediator between sets. When disputes arose that threatened to explode into full-scale war, Stone was one of the voices people listened to. Not because he was neutral. He was a Rollins 60 Crip through and through, but because people trusted his judgment. They knew he wasn't trying to play them, wasn't working an angle. He was genuinely trying to find solutions that let everyone eat. But the crack era was creating a generation that had no memory of those old values. Kids who'd been born in the late 1970s and came of age in the 1980s had never known anything but chaos. They'd grown up watching their mothers become addicts, watching older brothers get killed or locked up, watching the community destroy itself. They had no memory of a time when there were rules, when even gangsters had standards. These kids were different, harder, more reckless, more willing to kill over nothing, less interested in building anything, because they'd never seen anything built that lasted. Why plan for the future when you probably wouldn't live to see it? Stone should have seen it coming, should have realized that the world had changed too fundamentally for the old ways to survive. Should have known that extending trust to people who'd never learned the code was dangerous. But he believed. He still believed that if you treated people with respect, they'd return it. That honor still meant something, that the code could survive if enough people upheld it. That belief would kill him. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Stone was in his late 20s and early 30s, practically elderly by gang standards. The life expectancy for active gang members in South Central during that era was around 25 years old. Most of Stone's generation was gone, dead in shootouts, killed in ambushes, locked away in Folsom or San Quentin serving life sentences. But Stone had survived. Through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness when necessary, and genuine street credibility, he'd made it longer than the odds predicted for any black man in South Central involved in street life. He'd also become genuinely wealthy by street standards, not rich by conventional measures. He wasn't buying mansions or yachts, but he had multiple cars, property, money saved, investments in legitimate businesses. He'd built something sustainable. But wealth brought complications. Money made you a target. Success made people jealous. And in the new generation, success made people think you were vulnerable, soft, someone who could be robbed. Stone fronted weight to younger dealers regularly. It was how the game worked, how it had always worked. You helped people come up, gave them product on credit. They sold it, paid you back with interest, kept their profit. Everyone ate. The system worked if everyone honored their commitments. It required trust, but that trust was supposed to be backed by reputation and consequences. If you welched on a debt to an OG like Stone, everyone would know. Your reputation would be destroyed. No one would do business with you. And potentially, you'd face violent consequences. That system had worked for decades. It worked because people understood the rules and the consequences of breaking them. But the crack era had created a generation with no memory of those rules. Kids who'd grown up in complete chaos, who'd seen loyalty rewarded with bullets, who'd learned that morality was a luxury they couldn't afford. For them, the old code was just stories their fathers told, if their fathers were around at all. Stone worked with various young dealers from different sets. Some were solid. They took the product, sold it, paid back promptly, and built relationships that lasted. Those guys learned from Stone, absorbed some of his principles and went on to become successful in their own right. But others saw his fairness as weakness, his willingness to front product on credit as an opportunity to exploit, his trust as something to be betrayed. The Doc Crips were a set from another neighborhood, not Stone's own Rollins 60s, but allied through the larger Crips organization. They were younger guys, in their late teens and early 20s, hungry and reckless, in the way that generation was. Stone had done business with some of them before. Small transactions that went fine. He'd fronted them moderate amounts of marijuana. They'd paid back without issue. It seemed like they were learning the game properly. So when they approached him about a larger deal, a significant marijuana consignment they wanted to move, Stone agreed. The amount was substantial enough to matter, but not so large that losing it would cripple him financially. It was a calculated risk, the kind he'd taken hundreds of times before. The arrangement was straightforward. Stone would front them the product. They'd move it through their networks. They'd pay him back the cost plus his profit. They'd keep the difference. Standard business? Stone probably did his due diligence, asked around about them, confirmed they had the networks to move that much product, verified they weren't known for burning dealers. Everything probably checked out. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that these 4 young Crips had already decided they weren't paying him back. They'd watched Stone operate, knew he had money, knew he had product, knew he operated on trust and reputation. And they made a calculation that defined the new generation's mentality. Why pay him back when we could just take everything? It wasn't about disrespecting Stone personally. It wasn't about gang rivalry or personal beef. It was pure economics, through the lens of sociopathy. They saw an opportunity to come up big, not just keeping the profit from the consignment, but robbing Stone of whatever money and product he had on him during the exchange. They planned it carefully. This wasn't an impulsive decision. They thought about the location, the timing, what they'd need. They acquired weapons. They probably rehearsed it, talked through the steps. This was premeditated murder, not a deal gone wrong. They set up a meeting, told Stone they had his money, were ready to settle up. Probably acted friendly, professional, normal. Stone agreed to meet them in Duarte, California, a relatively quiet area with avocado groves about an hour from Los Angeles. The location made sense for a drug transaction. It was neutral territory, not Stone's neighborhood, not theirs. Low police presence. Rural enough that gunshots wouldn't immediately draw attention. Perfect for both legitimate transactions and ambushes. Stone brought one associate with him, a man whose name has been lost to history, but who would die beside him. It was standard practice. You never went to these meetings alone. Having backup was both a precaution and a signal of respect, showing you took the deal seriously enough to bring support. They drove to the meeting spot in Stone's SUV. Nice vehicle, clean. The kind that announced success without being obnoxiously flashy. The 4 young Crips were already there, waiting. And from that moment, Stone's fate was sealed. January 30th, 1992. The sun was setting over Southern California, painting the sky in oranges and purples. Stone drove with his associate, probably talking about normal things. Business, family, maybe sports. The Lakers were having a good season. Maybe nothing important, just the casual conversation of 2 men who'd known each other a long time. They arrived at the meeting spot in Duarte. The avocado groves stretched out in neat rows, trees heavy with fruit. It was quiet, peaceful even. The kind of place that seemed disconnected from the violence of South Central, though that violence had a way of following you wherever you went. The 4 young Crips were there as promised. Young faces, probably nervous, though they were hiding it. Murder, even when planned, activates something primal in humans. Your body knows you're about to do something terrible, even if your mind has rationalized it. What happened next has been pieced together from witness statements. There were apparently people nearby who heard things, saw parts of what occurred, forensic evidence, and street rumors that circulated afterward. The exact sequence is debated, but the broad strokes are clear and terrible. The meeting probably started normally. Casual greetings. "What's up, cuz?" The language of false brotherhood. Maybe some small talk before getting down to business. Stone was professional about these things. He treated drug deals like business transactions, because that's what they were. Then the conversation turned to the money. Stone asking where it was. The young guys probably stalling, making excuses. "It's in the car." "We need to talk about something first." Creating delay, building tension, waiting for the right moment. Then the energy shifted. The thing that makes the hair on your neck stand up. The instinct that tells you something's wrong. Maybe Stone noticed the young guys exchanging glances. Maybe he saw one of them touching his waistband where a gun was hidden. Maybe it was just the vibe, the feeling that something was off. But by the time he recognized the danger, it was too late. Guns came out. Multiple guns, pointed at Stone and his associate. Command shouted, "Don't move. Get in the car. Hands where I can see them." Stone was an OG. He'd been in countless dangerous situations, had guns pointed at him before. He knew how to read moments like this. Knew when talking could save you and when it was already over. This was already over. He and his associate were forced into the SUV at gunpoint, forced to sit in the front seats, while the young Doc Crips took control of the situation. This is when the wire came out. Not handcuffs, which police use. Not rope, which would have been easier to find. But wire. Thin, cutting, impossible to escape from. The young killers bound Stone's hands behind his back with the wire. Bound his associate's hands the same way. The wire cut into their wrists, drew blood. It was painful, deliberate, and unmistakably premeditated. You don't just happen to have wire on you. You bring it because you're planning to restrain someone, because you're planning to kill them. Stone knew what was coming. He'd been in the game long enough to recognize an execution setup. The isolated location, the restraints, the multiple guns. This wasn't a robbery where they'd take his money and leave. This was the end. But he tried anyway. Tried to appeal to whatever sense of honor, whatever connection to the code these young men might have. Maybe he thought about the meals he'd shared with them, the advice he'd given, the trust he'd extended. Maybe he thought about the fact that he'd fronted them product in good faith, believing they'd honor their commitment. "You ain't gotta do us like this, cuz," he said. The word cuz, short for cousin, the term Crips used for each other, carried enormous weight. It wasn't just slang. It was a reminder of their supposed connection, their shared identity, their brotherhood. It was an appeal to everything the Crips organization was supposed to represent. It was Stone's last appeal to the code he'd lived by his entire adult life. A code that said you didn't kill your own people, that you protected your brothers. That loyalty and honor meant something even in the criminal underworld. His voice probably carried disappointment more than fear. Disappointment that these young men he'd tried to help, tried to bring up in the game properly, had chosen this path. disappointment that the code meant nothing to them. The young killers probably hesitated for a moment. Murder, even when planned, requires overcoming a fundamental human resistance to killing. Looking into someone's eyes while you take their life is different from the abstract planning stage. But whatever hesitation existed didn't last long. They'd come too far to turn back. If they let Stone go now, they were dead men. He'd know who betrayed him. His retaliation would be swift and absolute. The only way forward was through. The shots came, multiple rounds fired from close range. The sound would have been deafening inside the vehicle. Gunfire in an enclosed space creates a concussive force that's physically painful. The muzzle flashes would have lit up the interior. The smell of gunpowder would have been overwhelming. Stone and his associate were both shot in the head, execution style. Quick, professional, final. Their bodies slumped forward in their seats, lifeless, hands still bound behind their backs with wire. The young killers took everything. Stone's money, probably several $1,000s he'd brought for business. His jewelry, the gold chain he wore, rings, a watch, the keys to his SUV, whatever product he might have had on him. They cleaned him out. Then they locked the vehicle doors from the outside. Another calculated choice. They wanted time before the bodies were found, time to get far away, time to establish alibis and get their stories straight. They left Stone and his associate there, between rows of avocado trees, as the California night settled in completely. Left them like garbage, like they were nothing, like 30 years of life and reputation and relationships meant absolutely nothing. The avocado grove was silent again, just trees and darkness and two dead men who'd believed in something that no longer existed. Morning came to South Central the way it always did, indifferent to the violence of the previous night. The sun rose over Crenshaw Boulevard, over the liquor stores and check-cashing places and barber shops. People woke up, got dressed, went about their business. But the news was spreading, moving through the invisible networks that connected the neighborhood faster than any newspaper or TV report could manage. Street intel, the telegraph system of the hood, was already crackling with the information. Stone was dead. Keith Stone Thomas, the OG from Rollins 60, was gone. Murdered. Not in a shootout or a drive-by. Executed, hands bound, left in a vehicle in Dwart. When news of Stone's death hit South Central fully, it hit different than other murders. And there were a lot of murders to compare it to. Gang violence was constant in early 1990s Los Angeles. The crack wars were still raging at full intensity. Young men died every single day. Funerals became so routine that people spoke about them casually. Mothers buried sons with heartbreaking regularity. The death toll had become background noise. But Stone's death shook people. It shook people who thought they couldn't be shaken anymore. The barber shops went quiet when the news came through. Men who were getting haircuts just stopped talking. The clippers kept buzzing, but the conversation died. Older men shook their heads, their faces showing something between grief and resignation. They killed Stone, someone would say, and everyone would know immediately what it meant. Not just that a man had died, but that something larger had ended. The liquor stores and corner stores became informal gathering places for people processing the news. Young guys standing around, Older OGs sitting on crates, everyone trying to make sense of it. OGs from every set, Crips who should have been celebrating a rival's death, Bloods who'd been at war with the Rollins 60s for years, gangsters from sets that had no direct connection to Stone. All stood silent, respected the moment, recognized what had happened, because they understood. This wasn't a rival gang killing an enemy in battle. This wasn't two sets clashing over territory or disrespect. This wasn't the normal violence that everyone had become numb to. This was the new generation killing the old guard. This was young wolves eating their own pack leader. This was the final, unmistakable death of the code that had kept some semblance of order in the chaos. They killed Stone, people repeated in conversations throughout the day. If they'd kill Stone, they'd kill anybody. The message was clear and terrifying. Nothing was sacred anymore. No reputation could protect you. No history of helping people mattered. No principle or code existed that couldn't be violated for money. The streets had gone completely feral. In the Rollins 60 neighborhood specifically, the grief was profound and personal. Stone had been one of theirs, one of their leaders, one of their success stories. He'd put in work for the set for over a decade. He'd looked out for younger members. He'd represented them in negotiations with other sets. He'd been what an OG was supposed to be. His death felt like a betrayal, not just of Stone personally, but of everything the set was supposed to represent. How could Crips kill a Crip OG who'd done nothing but help them? How could young members justify executing someone who'd fronted them product in good faith? There was immediate talk of retaliation. Young Rollins 60 members wanted blood. Wanted to ride on the dock Crips immediately, kill everyone involved, make an example so brutal that no one would ever think about doing something like this again. But the older OGs talked them down, at least temporarily. Not because they didn't want revenge. They absolutely did. But because they wanted to be smart about it. Wanted to identify exactly who was responsible. Wanted to make sure the retaliation was precise and devastating rather than scattered and ineffective. There was also a practical problem. Proving who did it. The young dock Crips weren't confessing. They'd scattered after the murder, established alibis, gotten their stories straight. Without witnesses willing to testify, and in South Central, witnesses never testified. It would be difficult to be certain who pulled the triggers. The police, for their part, launched an investigation. Stone's murder was high profile enough that it demanded attention. An OG getting executed was different from random gang violence. It suggested organization, planning, a level of boldness that concerned law enforcement. Detectives interviewed people in both the Rollins 60 and Dock neighborhoods. They collected forensic evidence from the crime scene. They tried to piece together Stone's movements in the days before his death, who he'd met with, what business he'd been conducting. But they ran into the same wall they always did in South Central. Nobody talked to police. Not because people didn't know things, but because talking to police marked you as a snitch, and snitches didn't survive long in that environment. Better to let the streets handle it than involve law enforcement. Stone's mother, the UCLA graduate who tried so hard to save her son from this exact fate, was devastated beyond words. She'd watched her brilliant boy get pulled into street life, despite her best efforts. She'd feared this call for years, had probably imagined it countless times. But when it actually came, when detectives appeared at her door to tell her Keith was gone, the reality was still shattering. She'd lost her son not to some noble cause or tragic accident, but to the senseless violence she'd spent his entire childhood trying to protect him from. All her education, all her hard work, all her love and sacrifice, none of it had been enough to save him. She planned his funeral with the same dignity she'd carried throughout her life. She insisted on a proper service, a proper burial. She would not let her son be reduced to just another gang statistic, another body, another name on a police report. The funeral was massive. Hundreds attended. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the street. Young gang members in their colors alongside elderly church ladies in their Sunday best. Stone's family, his friends from childhood, his associates from the streets, all packed together in grief. Many wept openly, not just women and children, but hardened gang members who hadn't cried in years. Men who'd seen countless friends die, who'd killed people themselves, who'd built walls around their emotions as a survival mechanism. Those men cried for Stone. They weren't just crying for the man. They were crying for what his death represented. The end of an era. The death of the code. The loss of whatever order and principle had existed in their world. The pastor tried to offer comfort, talking about salvation and God's mercy and seeing loved ones again in heaven. But his words seemed to bounce off the grief in that room. How do you make theological sense of a 30-year-old man executed by people he'd tried to help? Stone's mother held herself together during the service, her face composed, even as tears ran down her cheeks. She'd buried her son with dignity. That was all she could do now. After the funeral, the conversations continued. In cars driving away from the cemetery, in houses where people gathered, on street corners where the younger guys stood around, processing what they'd witnessed. The consensus was forming. Something fundamental had broken. The murder of Keith Stone. Thomas represented a line crossed, a boundary destroyed, a principle abandoned. And once those things were gone, they weren't coming back. Some of the OGs, shaken by Stone's death and countless others, started pushing harder for truces, for peace between the sets, for an end to the senseless violence that was consuming an entire generation. The Watts Truce of 1992 would come just months after Stone's murder. Major Crips and Bloods sets agreed to stop killing each other, at least temporarily. The truce was facilitated by former gang members turned community activists, by exhausted OGs, by mothers who'd lost too many sons. The image that would become iconic, Crips in blue and Bloods in red, standing together, shaking hands, declaring peace, shocked Los Angeles. It made national news. People wondered if maybe, finally, the violence could end. The truce didn't last perfectly. Truces never do. Too much history, too much pain, too many young members who didn't remember or care about the peace agreement. But it represented something important. A recognition that the old way was unsustainable, that an entire generation of young black men was being decimated, that something had to change. Would Stone have supported the truce? Almost certainly. He'd always been about strategy over senseless violence, about building rather than just destroying, about finding ways for everyone to eat rather than fighting over crumbs. He would have recognized that the streets were killing themselves and that survival required a different approach. But Stone wasn't there to support it. He was in the ground, killed by the very chaos he'd tried to prevent. Murdered by young men who represented everything he'd fought against. The 4 young Crips who killed Stone were eventually identified. The details of how this happened are murky. Some combination of street intelligence, police investigation, and someone's conscience or fear getting the better of them. According to various accounts, not all of them lived long enough to face trial. The streets have their own justice system, crude and brutal, but effective. When word definitively got out about who'd killed Stone, some of those young men found themselves targets, found themselves looking over their shoulders constantly, found themselves in situations where they were outnumbered and outgunned. Street justice is neither clean nor fair. It doesn't involve judges or juries or appeals. It involves bullets, often in the same execution style these young men had used on Stone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They'd killed Stone with hands bound and shots to the head. Some of them died the exact same way. Those who did survive to face the criminal justice system received lengthy sentences. Murder with special circumstances, premeditation, lying in wait, murder for financial gain. The kind of charges that carry life sentences without possibility of parole in California. The trials revealed the details that everyone in the streets already knew. The planning, the setup, the wire restraints that proved premeditation, the execution-style shots, the theft of Stone's money and property. It was laid out in court in clinical legal language that somehow made it seem both more real and more distant. The young killers showed little remorse during their trials, at least publicly. Whether they felt it privately is known only to them. But in court, they maintained the hard exterior that street life demanded. Showing remorse was showing weakness. Even facing life in prison, they couldn't abandon that mindset. The convictions brought some satisfaction to Stone's family and friends. Justice, such as it was, had been served. The men who'd murdered him would spend the rest of their lives in prison. They'd taken 30 years from Stone. The state took the rest of their lives from them. But the convictions didn't change anything fundamental. Stone was still dead. The code was still broken. The streets were still dangerous. And new young men were still making the same calculations that had led to Stone's murder. That robbery and murder were easier than honoring commitments. That respect meant nothing. That violence was the solution to everything. In the years that followed Stone's death, gang violence in Los Angeles would actually get worse before it got better. The mid-1990s saw murder rates that stunned even hardened observers. Young men continued dying over colors, corners, and perceived disrespect at rates that made South Central feel like a war zone. The LAPD's aggressive response, more gang units, more surveillance, more arrests, didn't fundamentally change the dynamics. Locking up dealers didn't stop the drug trade. Incarcerating gang members didn't eliminate gangs. The root causes, poverty, lack of opportunity, systemic racism, failing schools, broken families, remained unaddressed. But something else did start to happen. Some of the surviving OGs, shaken by Stone's death and countless others, began actively working to change things. They started intervention programs, reached out to younger gang members trying to pull them away from the streets, worked with community organizations to provide alternatives. Former gang members became some of the most effective violence prevention specialists because they understood the life in ways social workers and police never could. They could talk to young gangsters in their language, could relate to their circumstances, could offer credibility that came from lived experience. Some of the young men who'd known Stone, who'd learned from him before his death, took his lessons to heart. They started operating with more principle, more strategy, more concern for the community. They couldn't bring Stone back, but they could try to honor what he'd represented. The Watts Truce of 1992, despite its imperfections, did reduce violence significantly in some areas. Not everywhere, not permanently, but enough to give people hope. Enough to show that maybe, possibly, things could be different. Community organizations gained strength. Mothers who'd lost sons channeled their grief into activism, demanding better schools, more opportunities, different policing strategies. Church leaders expanded their outreach. Former athletes and entertainers who'd grown up in South Central came back to invest in the community. It was slow change, incremental, frustrating in its pace. But it was change. Stone didn't live to see any of it. He died at 30, executed in an avocado grove, betrayed by people he'd tried to help. But his death became part of the story that motivated change. The last OG killed by the chaos he tried to prevent became a symbol of why that chaos had to end. Today, more than 3 decades after Keith Stone Thomas died in that avocado grove, South Central Los Angeles has changed dramatically. The neighborhood itself has been renamed. Many parts are now officially called South Los Angeles, an attempt to distance the area from its violent past. Gang violence has decreased significantly from its 1990s peak. The massive police presence and mass incarceration of the crack era have receded somewhat. Some of the young men who survived have aged into older men. Many with children and grandchildren they're trying to keep away from the streets. Gentrification has transformed entire neighborhoods. Areas that were once war zones are now seeing rising property values, coffee shops, young professionals moving in. Longtime residents have mixed feelings about this. Safer streets are welcome, but displacement and loss of community are painful. The schools are somewhat better. The economic opportunities have slightly expanded. The sense of complete hopelessness that characterized the crack era has lifted enough to let people breathe. But the scars remain. An entire generation was lost to violence and incarceration. Families were destroyed. Communities were traumatized in ways that echo through generations. The young men who died in the 1980s and 90s left behind children who grew up without fathers, perpetuating cycles of poverty and dysfunction. The old gang structure has evolved. The massive sets that once controlled entire neighborhoods have fragmented into smaller, less organized groups. The territorial disputes continue, but at lower intensity. The crack trade has been largely replaced by other drugs, methamphetamine, fentanyl, bringing new problems. But old-timers, the few OGs who survived the crack era, still remember Stone. Still tell stories about him in barber shops and on porches and at family gatherings. The stories have taken on mythological qualities, growing with each retelling, but the core remains consistent. They talk about Stone's fairness in business dealings, how he'd front product to people just starting out and give them a fair chance to succeed. They talk about his strategic mind, how he could see 3 moves ahead like a chess player. They talk about his loyalty to his set and his neighborhood. They talk about the code he lived by, how he believed that even in the criminal underworld, there were rules that mattered, how he tried to maintain those standards even as the world around him abandoned them. And they talk about how he died, about the betrayal, about young men he'd tried to help deciding murder was easier than honor, about his final words, "You ain't got to do us like this, cuz," spoken to people who'd already decided those words meant nothing. The story of Keith Stone Thomas has become a cautionary tale told to younger generations. That's how Stone went out, OGs still say to young men getting involved in street life, trying to help some young fools who didn't understand the code. Don't trust people just because they call you cuz. Watch your back. Everybody ain't loyal. It's a lesson about the dangers of extending trust in an environment where trust is constantly violated. But it's also a lament for a world that was lost, where even criminals had principles, where your word meant something, where codes existed even if they were unwritten. Some people romanticize Stone and his era. They talk about the old days like they were better, like having a code made gang life noble somehow. This is selective memory. The crack era was devastating. The violence was horrific. The damage to communities was immeasurable. There was nothing noble about any of it. But there's also something to the idea that Stone represented, that even in terrible circumstances, principles matter, that how you treat people matters, that honor and loyalty aren't just nice concepts, but actual survival strategies. That building is better than destroying. Stone's mother passed away years after burying her son, never quite recovering from the grief of losing him to the streets she'd tried so hard to protect him from. She carried that pain until the end, the knowledge that despite her best efforts, despite her education and determination and love, she couldn't save her child from the violence of South Central Los Angeles. His grave is in a cemetery in Los Angeles. The headstone is simple, carrying his name and dates, and maybe a brief epitaph. People still visit occasionally. Old friends, former associates, people who remember. There's no grand monument to Keith Stone Thomas. No plaques or statues or official recognition. The city doesn't commemorate gang members, no matter how complex their stories. The history books don't record their names, except perhaps as statistics in the tallies of violence. But Stone's story survives in the oral tradition of South Central, in barbershop conversations where older men shake their heads and remember, in late-night reminiscences where survivors talk about friends long dead, in warnings passed down to younger generations about loyalty and betrayal. You remember, Stone? Someone will ask, and others will nod solemnly. They remember. They remember the man, the era, what his death represented. They remember because forgetting would be a final betrayal, erasing the memory of someone who tried to maintain standards in a world gone mad. The 4 young doc Crips who killed him are still in prison, assuming they survived. They're middle-aged men now, locked away for murders they committed when they were barely adults. They've spent more years in prison than they spent free. Whether they regret their actions, whether they understand what they destroyed, is known only to them. but their names are largely forgotten, while Stone's is remembered. In the strange calculus of street reputation, they're the young fools who betrayed an OG, while he's the legend who died believing in something. They achieved nothing lasting with their violence. He left a legacy that survives decades later. Keith Stone Thomas died believing in something that no longer existed: honor among criminals. A code that separated organized crime from chaos. A world where your word meant something, where loyalty was returned, where even in the drug game, certain lines weren't crossed. That world died with him in an avocado grove in Duarte, California, on January 30th, 1992. 30 years old, hands bound with wire, bullets in his head, betrayed by people he'd tried to help. Was Stone a good man? By conventional moral standards, absolutely not. He sold drugs that destroyed lives and communities. He participated in violence. He was part of a criminal enterprise that caused immeasurable harm to already struggling neighborhoods. He broke laws, hurt people, contributed to the chaos. But within the twisted logic of gang life, he represented something better than what came after. He believed in protecting his neighborhood, not just exploiting it. He believed in helping young men come up, not just using them as disposable soldiers. He believed in building something that could last, not just chasing the next score. He believed that even criminals could have principles, could operate by rules that prevented complete anarchy. The generation that killed him believed in nothing but immediate gratification, quick money and violence as the solution to everything. They inherited a world already on fire and threw gasoline on it. They took the worst aspects of gang culture, the violence, the exploitation, the nihilism, and stripped away whatever principles had provided some structure. Stone's death marked the moment when the old guard realized they'd lost. When the OGs understood that the code they'd lived by meant nothing to the new generation. When it became clear that experience and reputation couldn't protect you from young men who saw murder as easier than honor. You ain't gotta do us like this, cuz. Those 7 words echo across 3 decades as an epitaph, not just for one man, but for an entire era. A plea for honor in a world that had run out of it. A reminder that even in the darkest places, some people still believed in something. An appeal to shared identity. Cuz, cousin, brother. That went completely unheeded. Keith Stone Thomas believed. He believed that treating people with respect would earn respect in return. He believed that helping young men come up would create loyalty. He believed that maintaining the code would preserve some order in the chaos. He believed that even in criminal life, principles mattered. And that belief got him killed. But at least he died as he lived, refusing to abandon his principles, even when those principles were what put him in that SUV with wire around his wrists and guns pointed at his head. Even at the end, he appealed to the code, to honor, to their supposed brotherhood. Even knowing it wouldn't work, he tried. There's something tragic, but also dignified about that. Stone could have become like the generation that killed him. Ruthless, unprincipled, caring only about money and survival. He could have abandoned the code when it became clear it was a liability. He could have adapted to the new reality where honor meant nothing. But he didn't. He held on to his principles even when they made him vulnerable. He continued extending trust even when trust was constantly violated. He kept believing that people could be better, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. That makes him either noble or foolish, depending on your perspective. Maybe both. The streets have no monuments, no plaques, no official recognition of the men who walk them. History books don't record their names except as statistics, as body counts, as evidence of social pathology. Academic studies analyze them as data points in discussions of systemic racism, economic inequality, and criminal justice policy. But Stone's story survives in the spaces where official history doesn't reach. In barbershop conversations where old men remember their youth. In late-night talks where survivors share stories with younger people trying to understand where they came from. In warnings passed down through generations about loyalty, betrayal, and the costs of street life. That's how Stone went out. OGs still say, shaking their heads, trying to help some young fools who didn't understand the code, believing people would honor their word, trusting when he should have been suspicious. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of holding on to principles in a world that's abandoned them, but it's also a lament for something lost, a time when even in the criminal underworld, codes existed, when honor meant something, when being a gangster came with certain standards. The crack era destroyed a lot of things. It destroyed families, communities, entire generations. But maybe one of its most complete destructions was the death of the idea that even criminals could have principles, that there were rules everyone followed, that loyalty and honor could exist in dark places. Stone was the last believer, or one of the last. A man who held on to old values past the point of reason, past the point of safety. He died for those beliefs, murdered by people who couldn't understand why they mattered. 3 decades later, South Central has changed. The violence has decreased. Some things have gotten better. New generations have emerged with different priorities, different values, different possibilities. But the old-timers remember. They remember when giants walked these streets, when OGs like Stone commanded respect across every hood, when the code meant something, when even in the midst of terrible violence and poverty and struggle, certain principles held. They remember because forgetting would be the final betrayal. Forgetting would mean Stone died for nothing, that his principles meant nothing, that the code he lived by was just a fantasy that never really existed. So they keep his memory alive. Tell stories to younger people who didn't live through those times. Pass down lessons about loyalty and betrayal, about honor and consequences, about the cost of living by principles in a world that doesn't value them. You ain't gotta do us like this, cuz. Stone's final words remain a haunting reminder of what was lost, an appeal to brotherhood that went unanswered, a plea for honor that was ignored, a belief in codes and principles that died with him in an avocado grove, hands bound with wire, killed by people who saw his trust as weakness to exploit. The story of Keith Stone. Thomas is a tragedy in the classical sense, a man undone by his own virtues, destroyed by the very principles that made him respected. His fairness became naivety. His loyalty became vulnerability. His belief in codes became the weapon his killers used against him. But maybe there's something redemptive in dying for your principles, even if those principles are flawed, in refusing to abandon your beliefs even when they make you vulnerable, in trying, right up to the end, to appeal to something better in people, even when you know it probably won't work. Keith Stone Thomas was the last OG who believed in the code. And when they killed him, they killed something larger than one man. They killed the idea that street life could have honor, that criminals could have principles, that even in darkness, light could survive. The streets are darker for his absence, and that avocado grove in Duarte, California, will forever mark the place where an era ended, where the last believer fell, where the code died with a plea that went unanswered. You ain't gotta do us like this, cuz. But they did. And nothing was ever the same. In memory of all those lost to the violence of South Central Los Angeles during the crack era, may we learn from their stories, honor their memories, and build a world where such tragedies are no longer inevitable.